I was 16 years old when I learned that in the Sterling family, perfection wasn't just a goal. It was a requirement for existence. We were at the peak of the Sterling History Gala, surrounded by the elite of Greenwich. The air smelled of expensive lilies and old money. My father, Timothy, stood over the velvet family registry, his hand a heavy weight on my shoulder. He whispered in my ear that I was to sign the book with my right hand. He needed the press to see a flawless legacy, and a left-handed daughter didn't fit the image of the Sterling lineage. But biology isn't a choice you can just flip like a switch. As the cameras flashed, my hand moved instinctively. I picked up the gold fountain pen with my left hand. I didn't even get the first letter down. Timothy's hand came down like a gavel, knocking the pen across the room and splattering ink over the white silk tablecloth. He didn't yell. That would be common. Instead, he looked at me with a cold, hollow disgust and declared, loud enough for the front row to hear, that I was nothing but a glitch in our heritage. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. That moment on the stage was the last time I felt like I had a home. The walk from the ballroom to the carriage house was a blur of muffled whispers and the clicking of heels on marble. I was moved out of the main house before the gala guests had even finished their first course. The carriage house was a cold, detached structure that smelled of motor oil and the damp rejection of the Connecticut winter. I sat on a crate, staring at the dust motes in the single light bulb's glow, realizing I had been pruned. My mother, Sarah, came in an hour later. Her eyes were red, and she was clutching a silk handkerchief. For a second, I thought she was there to hold me. I thought she was crying for her daughter who had just been publicly humiliated by her own father. But then she spoke, and the illusion shattered. She sobbed about the tarnished gala. She wept for the reputation of the Sterling brand, and how my stubbornness had invited a stain into their perfect night. She wasn't mourning my loss, she was mourning her social standing. I realized then that my mother's love was a subscription service. And since I could no longer provide the perfection required for the premium tier, my access had been revoked. It was an audit of my soul, and I had been found to be a liability. The Whisper campaign started before the sun came up. I could hear them on their phones, already crafting the narrative for the neighbors. Aubrey has a genetic flaw. Aubrey is unstable. They were labeling me a failure to protect the lie of their own superiority. The trap of this kind of cruelty is that it becomes normalized. My parents didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as gardeners. And I was just a branch that refused to grow in the right direction. They felt that by treating me with such calculated coldness, they were simply maintaining the aesthetic of their lives. It's a specialized kind of psychological trap. When a family decides to scapegoat one child to make the golden child shine brighter, they stop seeing the person and start seeing a problem to be managed. I was that problem. I spent the next few weeks in that carriage house, feeling like a ghost in a museum. I was a prisoner in a house without bars. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. A silent chain that keeps you in an abusive environment because you've been told so often that the world outside won't want you either. But they were wrong. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I was waiting for the right moment to leave. One night, the door didn't just lock from the outside, it felt like the entire world had closed. My father told me through the heavy oak door that they couldn't have my influence near my younger sister, Madison, anymore. They were worried my glitch might be contagious. I grabbed my drafting tools and a single bag. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just walked out into the dark, barefoot in the grass, and headed toward the one person they had spent years calling the black sheep. My Aunt Margaret. I didn't waste a single moment looking back at the heavy iron gates of the Sterling estate. 16 years of trying to fit into their right-handed world had taught me one thing. I was never an investment to them. I was just overhead. I walked to Aunt Margaret's house, my drafting tools clutched to my chest as if they were the only things keeping me grounded. Margaret didn't ask me for an apology or a right-handed signature. She just opened the door and said, "It's about time you stopped trying to fix what was never broken." The next decade and a half passed in a fast-forward blur of success and silence. Under Margaret's tutelage, I didn't just survive, I dominated. I became an architectural restoration specialist, the ghost artist of the Northeast. I specialized in fixing what time and neglect had destroyed, working from the shadows to ensure my name never popped up on my parents' elite radar. While I was building an empire, one restored manor at a time, I kept a silent ledger on the Sterling family. I set up digital perimeters. I watched as Timothy and Sarah's legacy brand began to fray at the edges. Their arrogance had made them sloppy. They were living on the fumes of an old reputation, funding Madison's hollow debutante lifestyle while their actual capital dwindled. Madison, the golden child, was a professional vacuum of talent. She coasted through elite schools. But I noticed something strange in her digital footprint. She was submitting work that looked familiar, too familiar. I realized she had broken into my old childhood storage. She was digging through my trash to find her treasure, using my old left-handed sketches as the foundation for her genius. I didn't send a cease and desist. I didn't call to argue. I just started collecting the receipts. I gathered original timestamped files, metadata from my first professional contracts, and audio recordings of my parents calling me a glitch. I was building a case for a different kind of restoration, the restoration of my own name. Then, 16 years after they left me in the dark, they showed up at my studio door. They didn't look for an apology. They looked for a favor. Madison had been accepted into a top-tier international business school. But there was a catch. The school required a validation of professional portfolio. They needed me, the girl they disowned, to sign off on a $350,000 tuition sponsorship and publicly bless Madison's stolen work at her 18th birthday gala. Timothy stood there, his jaw still tight, his arrogance still blinding him. He spoke to me as if I were a line item in a budget he could still control. He told me it was my chance to rejoin the lineage by becoming Madison's silent backer. I looked at him, feeling nothing but a cold, transactional clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just looked at the non-disclosure agreement he placed on my desk and realized their arrogance had just built the stage for their own public execution. I accepted the invitation. I accepted the invitation to Madison's 18th birthday gala with a calm that clearly unnerved my mother, Sarah. They saw my compliance as a white flag, a sign that the glitch had finally learned her place in the family hierarchy. But they were operating under the delusion that I was still that 16-year-old girl in socks on a front porch. They didn't realize that, in my world, a restoration specialist doesn't just clean the surface. We dig until we find the rot underneath. While they were busy spending $350,000 on a rebranding gala for Madison, I was finalizing the audit of their lies. I consulted Aunt Margaret's legal team and made a discovery that elevated this from a family grudge to a criminal liability. Madison hadn't just borrowed my sketches to pass her classes. She had forged my professional digital signature on a series of restoration contracts to secure her elite business school admission. My parents weren't just complicit. They were the financiers of the fraud. They had been using a dwindling trust fund that technically belonged to my deceased biological mother to fuel this deception. They were so blinded by their need for the Sterling brand to remain perfect that they walked right into the arrogance trap. They actually believed I would sign a non-disclosure agreement to protect the sister who had smirked while I was burned. This is the psychological trap of narcissistic injury. To Timothy and Sarah, my existence was only valuable if it served their image. They viewed their cruelty as a necessary pruning of the family tree. They had normalized their behavior for so long that they couldn't conceive of a world where I held the power. They mistook my 16 years of silence for submission, never realizing it was actually the slow gathering of ammunition. I spent the final days before the gala preparing the projector slides. Every digital file had a timestamp, A piece of data that acted as a silent witness to the theft. I wasn't going to yell or make a scene. I was going to use cold, hard facts to dismantle their museum of lies, brick by brick. They wanted a public validation. I was going to give them a public execution. The night of the gala arrived. The Sterling estate was glowing, filled with the very people who had whispered about my glitch 2 decades ago. I walked in wearing a navy dress that was the polar opposite of Madison's flashy debutante gown. My father approached me, his smile as artificial as the flowers decorating the ballroom. He whispered that it was time to be a Sterling and sign the sponsorship papers on stage. I just looked at him and said, "It's time for the truth." Timothy. The Sterling Debutante Gala was designed to be a coronation, a high-stakes rebranding of the family's future. I arrived at the estate as the sun began to dip, casting long, dramatic shadows over the limestone facade. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of $500 floral arrangements and the desperate hum of a legacy fighting for air. Timothy Sterling was in his element, holding court with Greenwich's most powerful investors. He spotted me and offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that was just another line item in his budget of deception. He leaned in and whispered that it was time to bless Madison's path, handing me the gold fountain pen he had knocked from my hand 16 years ago. I watched him take the stage, the crystal chandeliers overhead sparkling like cold, hard evidence. He raised his glass to the crowd, his voice booming with a confidence that only comes from deep-seated hubris. He spoke of Madison as a natural-born genius, a visionary who had inherited the Sterling spark. He claimed I had returned to pass the torch to my sister, publicly linking my success to her stolen work. He was staking the entire Sterling brand on a lie, betting that my silence was a debt I would continue to pay. When he called me to the stage, the room went so quiet I could hear the rhythmic thump of the projector's cooling fan. I didn't take the pen. Instead, I pulled the remote for the projector from my clutch. I didn't need to yell. I let the data do the screaming. I clicked the first slide, and the screen behind us didn't show Madison's masterpieces. It showed the metadata, the digital fingerprints. I pointed to the creation dates. September 12th, 2015, when Madison would have been exactly 8 years old. The gasps from the audience were immediate. A sudden, sharp intake of breath that shattered Timothy's facade of perfection. Then, I played the audio. Timothy's own voice filled the ballroom, cold and sharp, calling me a glitch in the lineage and a genetic failure. I watched my mother's face drain of color as the elite of Greenwich heard the reality behind their carefully curated brand. It was a slow-motion shattering of their world. Madison's business school admission was revoked in real time as an official in the crowd stood up, his expression one of professional disgust. This was the payoff, the release of 16 years of manufactured shame. I felt the narcissistic injury I had prepared for. To Timothy and Sarah, I wasn't a daughter, I was a brand asset that had gone rogue. They were suffering not from guilt, but from the sudden absence of the power they thought they held over me. I looked at my Aunt Margaret in the back of the room. She gave me a single, sharp nod, the watchman finally resting her vigil. My victory wasn't just in the documents or the ruined gala. It was the realization that I was the only part of this lineage that actually had substance. The Sterling brand was a house of cards, and I was the wind. The silence in the ballroom after the audio ended was heavier than any physical weight I'd ever carried. I stood on that stage, not as a victim, but as a person with absolute clarity. Timothy Sterling looked at me, his mouth moving but no sound coming out, as his carefully constructed legacy turned to ash in front of his peers. I stepped down and walked toward the exit, but my mother, Sarah, blocked my path in the empty space behind the catering tables. Her eyes were wild, her performative tears replaced by a desperate, ugly panic. She begged me for the $350,000. claiming they needed it to settle the legal liabilities Madison's forgery had just triggered. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I simply pulled a single sheet of paper from my clutch and handed it to her. It wasn't a sponsorship agreement. It was a detailed invoice for 16 years of restoration fees, the cost of every mortgage payment and debt I had silently covered while they treated me like a glitch. I told her the Sterling brand was officially bankrupt, both financially and morally. This was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. My parents had spent decades pretending their status was built on superior character, when it was actually just a rented facade they couldn't afford. Without my money and Madison's stolen talent, they had nothing left to stand on. By the time I reached the valet, I heard that Timothy's investors were already pulling out. I drove back to my studio, the quiet of the night finally feeling peaceful instead of lonely. I sat at my desk, picked up a charcoal pencil with my left hand, and began to sketch. No more pretending. No more right-handed signatures to please people who never saw my worth. I opened the family group chat on my phone, looked at the chaos of their messages, and hit delete. To those of you listening who have always felt like you were at the edge, like you never quite fit the mold your family carved out for you, this is for you. Your worth is not a performance for their approval. You are not a glitch in someone else's lineage. You are the architect of your own. If you've ever been made to feel like a glitch in your own family, share this story. Let's remind everyone that your worth isn't determined by their expectations. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice served.